My wife is suggesting we open our marriage to my childhood friend. My wife and I have been together for 10 years, married for 8, and now have 2 small kids together. She is the love of my life and I could not imagine myself with anyone else. About 3 years into our marriage she started to show attraction to Asian characters in the shows and movies we watched together on our weekly movie nights. At first I brushed it off as a joke, but I realized she was serious about a month ago when we started watching Chicago Med. She joked often of wanting one of the characters, Dr. Choi, to be her doctor so he could feel her up. I laughed along, until she insisted we stop watching when Dr. Choi got into a relationship with another doctor. Thinking about it now, throughout our entire relationship Asian men caught her attention. For the past few years, she's been obsessed with popular K-pop members, joking how she would rather be with Eric Moon and Jimin. Even going as far to say that she's disappointed she got stuck with a white man and that our babies aren't as cute. A friend of mine since childhood is Korean and visits with us often. He and my wife have become friends. I always thought she acted weird around him, but I never took it personally until last night. As I was cleaning up dinner, she put the kids to bed and asked to sit down and have a talk about something important. I was hesitant, but agreed. She started it by saying that she didn't feel like our sex life was as fulfilling as it used to be. I was taken aback and asked what I could do to bring her more fulfillment. She suggested we bring in a third person into our sex life. I instantly knew she had someone in mind despite her denying it. After an hour of talking in circles she revealed she had been having sensual thoughts and urges regarding my childhood friend and she suggested I watch. I was stunned and told her I didn't want to discuss this anymore and slept in the living room. She took the kids to school this morning and went to help her sister pack as she is moving soon. We haven't spoken since last night and I don't know what to do. I'm sitting in my car outside my office writing this. I don't want to go home and see her knowing what she's thinking about. I think I want a divorce as she's clearly no longer the woman I fell in love with and I suspect she has already acted upon her urges with him. Is that too big of a jump over a sensual fantasy? Update post. To fill you all in relatively quickly, I returned home the night I made the post and my wife and I were still not speaking. I waited until she was putting the kids to bed to make a call to my friend. I wanted to talk to him alone. I slipped outside and made the call. I told him everything. He told me he was so sorry for me and that my wife's behavior was disgusting. He then confessed to me that a few years into my wife and I's marriage she, drunk, made a move on him at a mutual friend's party. It began as flirting and my friend was not entertaining it. She kissed him and he left the party early. I asked him why he never told me about it. He said he didn't want to ruin our marriage over something she did while drunk. They never spoke about it and continued as normal friends. Now that a week has passed I figured out that this party aligns with the start of her strange behavior towards Asian men in the media. I thanked him for sharing this with me and hung up. I immediately went inside and confronted my wife. I was officially disgusted with her for pushing a kiss on my friend and suggesting I watch her be with him. I told her exactly how I was feeling and what my friend had told me. My wife admitted she only asked to open our bedroom to him because she has had feelings for him for years and wanted to keep herself from cheating on me. I explained that she already had, and wrecked the foundation of our relationship. I told her we were divorcing, not to try and stop me. I was not changing my mind. In the last week I have been staying with friends and family. She has done nothing but harass me via my number. I am proud to say I have given her no attention. I see her still while stopping by my house during the day for my kids. They are too young to understand what's going on. As I mentioned in my last post they attend a daycare/schooling program for young children during the summer. As a result I never spend long in the house and typically leave while taking them there. She won't mention it in front of them so it hasn't been an issue. I have been seeking out a lawyer for divorce proceedings and looking for an apartment in my kids' school district. I feel relieved that many of you were right. Our marriage has been dead for a very long time. I'm not sure if I can ever see my friend the same way. I want to start therapy and try to work on it. He's been a very close friend since childhood and I would hate to lose him. My friends and family have been very supportive, so have most of you on Reddit. You've helped me very much and made me feel valid in my feelings. I thank you all for that. They screwed me out of my pay. I screwed them out of their company. Many years ago I got a job with a marketing company during phone deregulation. It was the Wild West and a lot of small long-distance companies sprang up, all trying to get a piece of the pie. Eventually, they all got bought up by the bigger fish, but at the time they were all paying hired gun marketing firms very well to score contracts for them to lock people in. I got a job with one of those marketing firms, a new age capitalism company that insisted we all do yoga and breathing exercises while they rang a little bell and gave us affirmations about how many contracts we were all going to sell and how much money we'd all make. The job was 100% commission, but I was always good at sales so I looked at the pay scale and noticed that it was exponential, presumably to entice people to work hard with impossible payouts. We were allowed to work as many or as few hours as we wanted, with the payout based on your weekly sales numbers. I decided I would give it a shot for 1 week to see how much I could realistically make before deciding whether I was willing to put up with the tasteless vegan snacks and mandatory voluntary yoga regime. For the next week, I pushed myself as hard as I could. For 7 straight days, I worked 14+ hour days every single day and used every trick and technique I'd learned doing sales to score as many contracts as I possibly could. I figured this would tell me my maximum possible income and could decide on that basis whether to stay. At the end of the week, I had blown everyone else out of the water. In fact, I had not just gotten more contracts than anyone there had ever seen in a week, I had gotten more than any of them had seen in a month. Because of the exponential scale, I realized that I was making absolutely ridiculous amounts of money, $10K plus a week. They had never expected anyone could actually hit those kinds of numbers. Coming in the next week, expecting a huge payday, I ended up with about 5% of what I expected. They told me there were problems with a lot of my contracts, and that I would be allowed to fix them and submit them a few at a time over the next several weeks. These problems were things like an apostrophe wasn't quite clear or the dash in someone's phone number was slightly crooked. They were going to screw me. That night I got a phone call from the company's office manager, Frank, who wanted to meet up for a drink. Curious, I agreed. Over beers, Frank told me that the owners of the company were in a panic because I would have bankrupted them. He said they spread out all my contracts on the floor of the office, then they crawled over them, inspecting each one and trying to figure out if I was committing some kind of fraud. When they comprehended that all my contracts were legit, they decided they had no choice but to screw me over. Frank told me he realized at that point that if they would screw me, they'd screw him too, and, besides, he was tired of doing yoga. He asked me if I would be interested in going into business with him and going head to head with his bosses. I thought it sounded intriguing, but I asked him how he thought we could compete. Frank explained that he had found out they didn't actually have the contract for our city. They were acting as independent contractors for another company that had the contract to market the service in an entirely different city. They were poaching here because the person who did have the contract wasn't actively using it. We put together a pitch and approached the guy with the real contract, Joe, and told him about the people poaching his turf. We agreed that we'd split with him, we'd take the upfront money for each contract, and he'd get the back-end money down the road. It was a good deal for everyone, so Joe contacted the phone company and had them threaten the poachers with a big lawsuit if they didn't stop. A week later Frank and I strolled into the offices of our old employer. Most of the furniture, and all the yoga mats, was gone, and there was just a table, a couple of filing cabinets, and a file box with the final pay envelopes for everyone. I made a show of counting my money to make sure it was all there, and the two owners, husband and wife, told Frank and I bitterly that they'd had to take cash advances on their credit cards for this money, and asked me if I felt guilty for destroying their lives. I smiled and said, nope, and left. Our marketing company made us a lot of money over the years until the company got bought up by Sprint and the gravy train ended. My boyfriend hasn't been the same since we went on vacation. If I hadn't drunk an entire gallon of tea back at the hotel, maybe none of this would have happened. Well, maybe if we hadn't gotten kicked out of the hotel, none of this would have happened. It had been just the two of us in the small car, but with the animosity heavy in the air, it felt overcrowded. I don't know what had been worse, the hour of arguing, the 2 hours of silence afterwards, or the burgeoning realization that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. I studied him out of the corner of my eye. We'd been together for several months, but the recent experience left me wondering if I had ever even met the real Brian, who he truly was on the inside. It had been our very first trip together. We'd saved up for one of those super fancy hotels and had been having a great time, until, of course, Brian decided to attempt a 5-finger discount in the jewelry store in the lobby. He'd told me when we first started dating that he'd had some run-ins with the law in the past, when he was young, and that was the only way to put food on the table, and I'd understood. But this wasn't the same. It wasn't for survival, it was just greed. We'd both spent the rest of our vacation money and then some, paying for that $1,800 watch so no charges would be pressed. They still kicked us out. I don't blame them. Asking him to stop at the next place we came across was the first thing I'd said to him in hours, and he nodded, solemnly. My discomfort was escalating to the point where I was considering asking him to pull over on the side of the road, rain be damned, when we saw the dim sign flickering in the distance. The small store was out of place on the quiet, tree-lined mountain road. We'd been deep in a tunnel of trees and hadn't seen so much of a hint of the lights in the distance. It seemed to just appear into view as we went around the bend. I didn't recall seeing it on the way to the hotel, so it was a pleasant surprise. I felt a flood of relief wash over me. It stuck out in the otherwise beautiful mountain landscape, windows so dirty that the light inside barely reached us through them, several letters on the sign lit up in such a way that the only word we could even see was a blood-red dash mark flickering. Any relief I'd managed to feel was short-lived. When we walked in, we both froze as we took in the interior. I instantly wished we'd just stopped by the side of the road after all. I looked at Brian and could tell he felt it too. He was fiddling with his new watch and took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, and put them back on, as if that would make what he was seeing make more sense. There were no other customers, no employees visible, it was just the two of us. Ceiling tiles hung askew, and the floor was filthy. We had to step over a drain in the floor with grimy stains circling it, to walk in. If it weren't for the lights, gentle hum of the AC, and grinding sounds floating from down the long hallway at the back, I'd have thought the place was abandoned. It was humid inside, and the smell coming from the old coolers that lined the back walls hit me as soon as we walked in. It reminded me of the summer my dad had decided to dabble in taxidermy in our basement. The slight hint of rot that lingered on the damp air indicated poorly done taxidermy, at that. As I darted towards the back towards the restroom sign, a placard dangling off it caught my eye, informing me the restroom was for paying customers only. I quickly perused the shelves for something to buy. The aisles were tall, nearly to the ceiling, and despite the store being somewhat small, I felt the panic sense of being cornered and trapped in an endless maze, at risk of becoming lost in there forever. The food on the shelves resembled nothing like the usual chips and candy these types of stores carried. There were rows upon rows of soft-looking mystery items in plastic wrap. Some of them leaked a red-brown residue down the shelves. None of it looked remotely appealing. I passed by a section with a stained placard that said handcrafted from local artists that was filled with eclectic items, none of which seemed to go together. There were torn shirts with random logos, nothing related to the town or area we were in, stained with mud, grass, and God knows what else. Dried ropey things formed small and delicate sculptures of animals unlike any I'd seen before. I reached for a bracelet with intricately carved white beads but nearly dropped it when I realized the band was made up of woven human hair. It left a residue on my hand, and I noticed then that the same sour rot smell was coming from the collection of items, too. I opted for a flat and lukewarm Dr. Pepper instead, and placed two $2 coins on the glass counter in front of the hand-scrawled shoplifters will be processed sign near the register. I figured I misread it. After all, it looked like it had been written by a hand unused to holding a pen. Brian had grabbed an armful of those unnerving plastic wrapped packages but hovered at the counter a bit too long. I could hear the scrape of him retrieving the coins on the glass, the sound of him dropping them into his pocket. He gave me a pointed stare as he did so. I sighed, so tired of arguing that I just walked away from him and down the hallway. I figured I'd pay, again, after he got back in the car. No sooner had I closed the door to the women's room behind me, than I could hear him talking to someone. His voice rose until he was nearly yelling. Mortified and trying to delay being involved in another incident that day, I splashed water on my face while trying to drown out what appeared to be a one-sided argument. I kept trying to wash the grimy feeling that had lingered on my hands after picking up the bracelet, but no matter how I scrubbed, I couldn't get it off. It kept getting worse. I felt nauseous when I realized the greasy residue was coming from the pale yellow bar of soap. I decided I'd scrub my hands raw at our next stop, and stepped out into the hall and back to the store. Brian wasn't there. I called out for him, but all I heard in answer was that same vague whirring and drilling sound coming from further down the long hallway. I doubled back to the car, but found it empty. I circled the store, my frustration turning to panic as I shouted his name and still got no response. I called his phone, it just rang, and rang before going to voicemail. The car was locked and he had the keys. I couldn't help but feel nervous, standing out there in the rain. We were still in the middle of the deep woods and with clouds obscuring the light of the moon and stars, the area was blanketed in darkness. I reluctantly headed back inside. Somehow, the smell had managed to become even worse. I gagged when the wet, disgusting air hit my nose again. It was so strong I could nearly taste it, putrid on my tongue. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was always someone just behind me as I walked quickly through the tall aisles, but whenever I looked over my shoulder, there was never anything there. I called his phone, wondering how I'd managed to lose him in such a small store when I finally heard it ringing. It was echoing from down that long hallway. As I headed towards it, I heard someone moving on the other side of the floor-to-ceiling aisle, placing something onto the shelf with a sickening wet thud, before weaving lightly through the aisles behind me. "Brian?" I called out softly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, trying to disguise my fear. I knew it wasn't him. I don't know how, but I knew it. Have you ever had the feeling that if you look closely enough at something, if you truly see it, you'll never be able to close your eyes again without it haunting you? That feeling of being in close proximity to something that your fragile mind was never meant to know existed? I forced myself to turn around anyways. Once again, whoever or whatever had been there was gone by the time I rounded the aisle, but I heard a gentle clinking sound, and saw a trail of red paint droplets. I followed it back to that section, handcrafted from local artists. There was something new hanging from a hook near the shelves. Wet, glistening strips dangled from along what looked to be a curved bone with bits of gristle still attached. From one of them hung an expensive men's wristwatch, another was tied around a shattered, thick glasses lens. Yet another sagged under the weight of car keys. They gently swayed with the motion of having been recently placed. Fluid continued to drip from the still wet viscera and mingled with the mud on my shoes. Shoplifters will be processed. I didn't need to see the items down the other aisles to figure out what I was looking at, what must have happened. I could already tell that we'd never have another argument, ever again. I heard a door open and close in the back, soft footsteps approaching from down that hallway. I realized that in my distraction, I'd forgotten to put money back on the counter. I choked up, but knew there was nothing I could do for him. So, I tossed the first bills I found in my purse onto the floor, frantically untangled the car keys, and in shock, I drove myself the remaining 4-hour drive home. Every so often, along the quiet country roads, those I could have sworn were empty on the drive up, I'd see that grimy building, the sign, marked flashing in the distance. I didn't stop once. I've been home for a week now. A few nights ago, something triggered a motion alert on my video doorbell, but there was no one there when I checked the footage. The next morning, I found a cardboard box on my porch, with no stamp or return address. In it was a torn t-shirt, and several of those now familiar wrapped packages, putrid fluid leaking out of them through the bottom of the soggy cardboard. I've received a similar box every night, since. I don't know if it's meant as a threat, or if due to some sort of twisted interpretation, I'm now a paying customer - he's slowly being returned to me. Either way, it turns out that I've gotten to see who Brian was on the inside, after all.